She ripped the maid's uniform in front of everyone. Not knowing the man she was trying to impress had already seen everything. The chandelier light shimmered across polished marble floors as laughter and soft music filled the grand hall of the Kong estate in Seoul, a place where silence was usually more powerful than words. But tonight, silence had been replaced by whispers sharp enough to cut. Amelia Carter moved quietly between guests, her black uniform pressed neatly, her posture straight, her eyes lowered just enough to stay invisible, but not enough to seem weak, a balance she had mastered over years of being underestimated in rooms exactly like this one. She carried a tray of crystal glasses, the faint clink echoing against the walls lined with imported Italian stone, each step measured, each breath controlled. Because in a house like this, one mistake didn't just cost you a job, it cost you dignity. Han Seo-yeon stood near the center of the room, draped in silk that caught the light like liquid gold, her smile sharp, her gaze sharper, the kind of woman who didn't need to raise her voice to command attention, because attention bent toward her naturally. And yet, tonight, something in her expression wasn't satisfaction. It was irritation, a quiet storm building behind perfectly applied composure. "You," she said suddenly, her voice slicing clean through the music. And just like that, every conversation softened, every head turned, and Amelia stopped mid-step, her fingers tightening slightly around the tray as she looked up. "Come here." The room shifted, subtle but undeniable. As Amelia approached, each footstep echoing louder than it should have, the air thick with anticipation that no one dared acknowledge. Seo-yeon's eyes scanned her slowly, deliberately, as if examining something beneath her worth noticing, her lips curling just enough to suggest amusement. "It's strange," she said, almost lightly, though nothing about her tone felt light, "how someone in your position forgets where she belongs." A few guests exchanged glances, a quiet ripple of discomfort spreading. But no one spoke, no one intervened, because power had already chosen its side. Amelia said nothing, her hands steady, her breathing even, though her pulse pressed hard against her ribs, a silent rhythm only she could hear. "Answer me," So-yeon continued, stepping closer, her heels clicking against the marble with deliberate precision. "What were you doing upstairs last night?" The question hung in the air like something heavier than accusation, something designed not to uncover truth, but to create spectacle. Amelia's voice, when it came, was soft but clear. "I was working, ma'am." A pause, then a smile that didn't reach Seo-yeon's eyes. "Working," she repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it insufficient. The next moment happened too fast for anyone to react, yet slow enough for everyone to remember. Seo-yeon reached forward, her fingers gripping the fabric at Amelia's shoulder, and with a sharp motion, the sound of tearing cloth cut through the room. The music didn't stop immediately, but the energy did, collapsing into a stunned stillness as the rip echoed louder than it should have, louder than it had any right to be. Amelia didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, holding the torn edge of her uniform in place, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable, as if the moment belonged to someone else. Around them, whispers began, low and uneasy, guests shifting, phones half raised before hesitation took over, because something about the air had changed, something unseen but undeniable. At the far end of the hall, near the grand staircase, a figure stood in shadow, still, silent, watching. Kang Ji-hyun had arrived minutes earlier, unnoticed as always, his presence folding into the room like a quiet storm waiting for the right moment to break. His gaze moved from the torn fabric to Amelia's face, then to his wife, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, not yet, but something far more controlled, far more dangerous. And in that moment, though no one realized it, the night had already shifted, because what Seo-yeon thought was a display of power had just become a test she was never meant to fail. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, thin and fragile like glass about to crack under pressure. And in that silence, every person in the room felt it, the shift, the subtle realization that something had gone too far. Amelia's fingers remained steady against the torn fabric of her uniform, holding it together not out of fear, but out of something quieter, something stronger, a refusal to let the moment define her. Her breathing was even, controlled, but her mind moved quickly, replaying every second that had led here, every choice, every step that had placed her in this room, under lights too bright for dignity to hide. Han Xiaoyun tilted her head slightly, studying Amelia's lack of reaction with growing irritation, because this was not how it was supposed to go. There should have been tears, apologies, something that would confirm the hierarchy she had just enforced in front of everyone. Instead, there was stillness, and stillness was harder to dominate. "Look at you," Xiaoyun said softly, her voice carrying across the room with deliberate calm. "Not even a word. Do you think silence will protect you?" A few guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two women, unsure whether to remain spectators or pretend this was not happening at all. Amelia lifted her gaze, not fully, but enough to meet So-Yun's eyes for a brief moment. And in that moment, there was no defiance, no challenge, only clarity. "I have done nothing wrong, ma'am," she said, her voice steady, each word measured, leaving no room for interpretation. The statement did not echo loudly, but it carried, cutting through the room in a way no raised voice could. Xiaoyun's smile tightened, her composure beginning to fracture in ways only the closest observers could detect. "Nothing wrong," she repeated, her tone sharpening. "Then explain why you were upstairs last night." The question landed heavier this time, pulling the attention of the room tighter, drawing everyone closer into a story they did not fully understand but could not look away from. Amelia hesitated, not out of fear, but out of calculation, because she knew that truth, in a place like this, was not always received as truth. "I was checking on something," she replied quietly. That answer was not enough, and everyone knew it. Xiaoyun took a step closer, her presence imposing, her voice lowering just enough to force the room to lean in. "Checking on what?" she asked. Before Amelia could respond, a faint sound interrupted the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The slow, deliberate echo of footsteps descending marble stairs. Heads turned instinctively. Conversations that had barely survived the tension now dissolved in quiet precision. The torn fabric, the posture of his wife, the stillness of the maid. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Xiaoyun straightened slightly, her confidence adjusting, recalibrating to his presence, because this was no longer her stage alone. Jae-hyun did not raise his voice, did not rush, did not react in the way anyone expected. Instead, he stepped forward once, then again, until he stood within the circle that had formed around them, his eyes settling first on Amelia. "Why were you upstairs last night?" he asked, his tone even, controlled, the same question, but now carrying a weight that shifted the ground beneath it. The room held its breath. Amelia looked at him fully this time, and for the first time since the moment began, something flickered in her expression, not fear, but something closer to hesitation, the kind that comes when truth has consequences. "Your son was not feeling well," she said softly. The words landed quietly, but their impact was immediate, visible in the subtle tightening of Jae-hyun's jaw, in the almost imperceptible shift in his gaze. "He had a fever," she continued, her voice steady, and there was no one there. The silence that followed was no longer fragile. It was heavy, grounded, pressing down on every person in the room. And in that silence, the story everyone thought they understood began to unravel. The words did not echo, but they settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored, pressing against every polished surface and every carefully maintained expression until even the air felt heavier to breathe. Kang Ji-hyun did not move immediately, but something in his posture shifted, subtle yet unmistakable, like a line had been crossed somewhere unseen, and now everything on the other side of it had changed. His gaze remained on Amelia, steady, searching, not for weakness, but for truth, and what he found there was not fear, not manipulation, but something far quieter, something that did not need to defend itself because it already knew it stood on solid ground. No one was there, he repeated, his voice low, controlled, each word measured with precision. Amelia shook her head once, slowly. No, sir. Around them, the guests remained frozen in place, caught between curiosity and discomfort, their earlier whispers now replaced by a silence that demanded attention. Han Seo-yun let out a soft laugh, the sound carefully crafted, but just a fraction too sharp, as if it had been forced into existence to regain control of a moment slipping away. That is quite a story, she said, folding her arms lightly, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her calm. So now the maid is not only wandering into private rooms, she is also inventing excuses. A few guests nodded faintly, clinging to the familiar structure of hierarchy, because it was easier than accepting uncertainty. But Jae-hyun did not look at them. He did not look at his wife. He continued to look at Amelia. What time? He asked quietly. The question landed differently, not accusatory, not dismissive, but deliberate. Amelia answered without hesitation. Around 2 a.m. Another pause. This one longer. The kind that stretched just enough for doubt to creep into the edges of the room. Jae-hyun's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time his gaze shifted, not away, but past Amelia, toward the staircase that led to the upper floor, to a place no one else in the room had seen that night. Who was assigned to the night shift? He asked, his voice still even, but now carrying something colder beneath the surface. No one answered immediately. Staff members near the edge of the room lowered their eyes, their silence louder than any response. So-yun exhaled softly, stepping forward as if to reclaim the narrative. This is unnecessary, she said, her tone light but firm. We are in the middle of an event. If there was an issue, it could be handled later. Jae-hyun did not respond to her. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough to address the head housekeeper standing near the far wall. Answer the question. The command was not raised, but it did not need to be. The woman straightened instantly. It was supposed to be Minji, sir, she said carefully, but she reported feeling unwell yesterday evening. And who replaced her? Jae-hyun asked. A brief hesitation. No one, sir. The words landed harder than any accusation, and this time, the silence that followed was not uncertain. It was absolute. Seo-yun's expression flickered, just for a moment, something between surprise and realization, before composure rushed back in to cover it. Even if that is true, she began, her voice tightening slightly, it does not explain why she was in your private area without permission. Amelia did not speak again. She did not need to, because now, the room was no longer looking at her. It was looking at him. And Kang Ji-hyun finally turned his full attention to his wife, his expression unchanged, but the distance in his eyes unmistakable, as if something fundamental had shifted beyond repair. It explains enough, he said quietly. The words were simple, almost understated, but they carried a finality that settled over the room like a closing door. And in that moment, the power that had once belonged entirely to Seo-yun began to slip, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that everyone present could feel, even if no one dared to acknowledge it out loud. The finality in Kang Ji-hyun's voice did not need to be raised to command the room. It settled into every corner with quiet authority, leaving no space for argument, no room for interpretation. And for the first time that evening, Han So-yun did not immediately respond. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but those who had spent enough time around power recognized it instantly. The moment when control slipped not through force, but through truth that could no longer be dismissed. Seo-yun's fingers curled slightly at her sides, her polished composure holding, but just barely, like a surface stretched too tight over something beginning to crack beneath. You are choosing to believe her, she said at last, her tone carefully measured, though the softness now carried a faint edge, over your own wife. The words were not loud, but they were designed to redirect the room, to pull the narrative back into familiar territory where loyalty defined right and wrong. A few guests shifted again, some nodding faintly, because that version of reality was easier to accept. But Jae-hyun did not react to the framing. His gaze remained steady, not confrontational, not emotional, simply certain. "I am choosing what is consistent," he replied, his voice calm, almost detached, yet each word carried weight, as if it had already been considered long before it was spoken. The statement lingered, and in its simplicity, it dismantled the argument Seo-yeon had tried to build. Consistency did not bend to status, and in that moment, status had begun to lose its protection. Seo-yeon let out a quiet breath, stepping closer, lowering her voice as if proximity could restore influence. Even if she checked on him, she said she had no right to be there without permission. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Amelia, then back to her husband. "There are boundaries in this house." Amelia remained still, her hands now resting calmly at her sides. The torn fabric no longer clutched as tightly, not because the damage had lessened, but because something else had taken its place, something steadier than defense. Jae-hyun finally shifted his attention fully to So-yeon, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow, as if everything else had faded into the background. "There are responsibilities in this house as well," he said quietly. The words were not directed at anyone else, yet everyone felt them. Seo-yeon's expression faltered, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of hesitation that revealed recognition before denial could cover it. "The responsibility to ensure that no child is left alone when they are unwell," he continued, his tone unchanged, but the meaning unmistakable now, clear and unyielding. The room absorbed the statement slowly, the implications settling over the guests like a weight that could not be ignored. A few exchanged glances, the earlier confidence in their silence now replaced by uncertainty, because the story had shifted beyond what they had expected to witness. Seo-yeon straightened slightly, her chin lifting, attempting to reclaim ground that had already begun to slip away. "Are you suggesting this is my fault?" she asked, her voice controlled, though the question itself revealed more than it concealed. Jae-hyun did not answer immediately. He let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the question to be fully understood, for the room to feel the tension that now belonged not to Amelia, but to Seo-yeon. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, carrying a quiet finality that did not invite further debate. "I'm stating what happened," he said. The distinction was small, but absolute. Facts did not require suggestion, and they did not negotiate with perception. Seo-yeon's gaze wavered, just slightly, her certainty no longer as solid as it had been moments ago, because for the first time, she was no longer speaking from a position that guaranteed agreement. Around them, the silence deepened, no longer fragile or uncertain, but grounded, anchored by a truth that had reshaped the room. And in that silence, Amelia stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, unchanged. In posture, unchanged in voice, yet no longer unseen, because something greater than status had finally been acknowledged, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that left no doubt about where the balance had shifted. The silence did not break. It settled deeper, heavier, pressing against every polished surface and every carefully controlled expression until even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed too loud for the moment. No one reached for their glass. No one dared to whisper, because the balance of the room had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Kang Ji-hyun stood exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but the weight of his attention had moved, no longer searching, no longer questioning, now deciding. Han Seo-yeon felt it before he spoke, the subtle withdrawal of certainty, the quiet collapse of the ground she had been standing on. She straightened again, instinctively, her voice returning with a controlled calm that masked the tension beneath it. "This is being exaggerated," she said, her tone lighter now, almost dismissive, as if the entire situation could still be folded back into something insignificant. A misunderstanding, nothing more. The words were carefully chosen, designed to minimize, to restore order, to remind the room of what it was supposed to believe. A few guests shifted again, eager for resolution, for something that would allow them to relax, to return to the safety of distance. But Jae-hyun did not follow that path. He took a slow step forward, then another, closing the space between himself and Amelia until he stood directly in front of her. The movement was simple, but it redirected every gaze in a room, pulling focus away from Seo-yeon and placing it where it had not been allowed to rest before. Amelia did not move. She did not lower her eyes this time. She met his gaze fully, steady, unguarded, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Not familiarity, not comfort, but recognition, the quiet acknowledgement of truth that did not need to be proven. Then, without a word, Jae-hyun removed his jacket. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, the fabric of the tailored suit catching the light as he slid it off his shoulders. The room watched, confused at first, uncertain of what. This meant because it did not match any expectation they had prepared for. He stepped closer, just enough to bridge the final distance, and gently placed the jacket over Amelia's shoulders, covering the torn fabric with a gesture so simple it carried more weight than anything that had been said. Amelia's breath caught, just slightly, the first visible break in her composure, not from fear, but from something she had not expected, something she had not prepared herself to receive. Around them, the reaction was immediate, not in sound, but in stillness, a deeper, sharper silence that spread through the room as every guest processed what they had just witnessed. Seo-yeon's expression froze, the controlled calm finally cracking at the edges, because this was not correction, this was not neutrality, this was a statement. Jae-hyun adjusted the jacket lightly, ensuring it sat properly on Amelia's shoulders, his movements precise, almost careful, as if the act itself demanded respect. Only then did he turn, slowly, his attention returning to his wife, but now the distance between them felt wider than the room itself. "This house does not mistake care for misconduct," he said quietly. The words were not loud, but they landed with finality, closing the door on every assumption that had been made. Seo-yeon opened her mouth to respond, but no words came immediately, because for the first time, there was no position left to stand on that did not contradict what everyone had just seen. Jae-hyun did not wait for her answer. He shifted his gaze briefly toward the guests, his expression calm, composed, but carrying a weight that needed no explanation. "The event is over," he said simply. No raised voice, no dramatic command, yet the effect was immediate. Conversations did not resume. Music did not return. Guests began to move, quietly, quickly, gathering their things with a subtle urgency, because something in the room had made it clear that staying was no longer appropriate. Within moments, the grand hall that had once been filled with laughter and light began to empty, leaving behind only silence, polished marble, and the echo of a moment that none of them would forget. And at the center of it, Amelia stood, wrapped in a jacket that did not belong to her, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, while across from her, Seo-yeon remained still, her reflection caught faintly in the glass. Walls, watching as the world she had controlled shifted without her. The last of the guests disappeared through the tall glass doors, their footsteps fading into the quiet night outside, leaving behind a silence that felt entirely different from before, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but settled, deliberate, as if the house itself had exhaled and was now waiting. The grand hall, once filled with soft laughter and carefully curated elegance, now stood nearly empty, the golden lights reflecting off untouched glasses and abandoned conversations, remnants of a moment that had unraveled faster than anyone had expected. Amelia remained where she stood, the weight of Kang Ji-hyun's jacket resting across her shoulders, the fabric still carrying a faint warmth that did not belong to her, yet somehow felt grounding, steadying. She did not move to adjust it again. She did not step away. For the first time since she had entered this house, she was not calculating where to stand or how to be seen. She simply existed in the space, and the space did not reject her. Across from her, Han Seo-yeon had not moved either. The confidence that once defined her posture had softened, not completely gone, but altered, as if she were now standing in a version of the room she no longer fully recognized. Her gaze lingered on Amelia for a moment longer than necessary, not with anger this time, but with something more complicated, something that had not been part of the evening she had planned. Kang Ji-hyun turned slightly, his attention shifting away from the empty doorway and back into the room, his presence no longer commanding an audience, but still carrying the same quiet authority. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he walked past So-yeon without pausing, without acknowledging the tension that lingered between them, as if that moment had already been decided and required no further attention. He stopped a few feet from Amelia, close enough that his voice did not need to travel far, but not so close as to invade the space he had just protected. "Did you give him anything for the fever?" he asked, his tone steady, practical, as if the earlier confrontation had been nothing more than a necessary interruption. Amelia blinked once, slightly surprised by the question, then nodded. "Yes, sir. I used the children's medication from the cabinet, and I stayed until his temperature went down." Her voice remained calm, but there was a softness now, a quiet shift from defense to explanation, because for the first time she was being asked not to justify her presence, but to share what she had done. Ji-hyun listened without interruption, his gaze focused, attentive in a way that did not feel performative, but intentional. "How high was it?" he asked. 102 degrees, she replied. A brief pause followed, and in that pause, the weight of what could have happened settled quietly into the room, unspoken but understood. Ji-hyun nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, but it carried more meaning than any extended praise. "You did the right thing," he said. The words were simple, direct, and final, not exaggerated, not emotional, but certain, and in their certainty, they restored something that had been taken moments earlier, something that could not be replaced by apology alone. Amelia lowered her gaze slightly, not out of submission, but out of humility, the recognition of being seen without needing to prove anything further. Behind them, So-yeon shifted, the sound of her heels against the marble breaking the stillness just enough to remind them of her presence. She took a step forward, then stopped, as if unsure whether to continue, her voice, when it came, quieter than before. "I was not aware," she said, the statement incomplete, lacking the certainty it once would have carried. Jae-hyun did not turn to face her immediately. He let the words exist in the air, unchallenged, but also unvalidated, before finally glancing in her direction. "That is clear," he replied. The response was not harsh, but it left no room for reinterpretation, no space to reshape what had already been revealed. So-yeon's gaze lowered slightly, her composure intact but altered, as if something fundamental had shifted beyond her control. The room remained quiet, the kind of quiet that followed not conflict but clarity, and in that clarity, the roles that had once defined the evening no longer held the same weight. Amelia stood in borrowed fabric, no longer invisible, no longer reduced, while Kang Ji-hyun remained beside her, not as a shield, but as a witness to something that had finally been acknowledged. And in the stillness that followed, the house itself seemed to recognize the change, holding on to it, as if it understood that some moments did not need to be repeated to be remembered. The quiet did not fade. It deepened, settling into the walls and the polished floors as if the house itself was holding onto the moment, unwilling to let it slip away too easily. Amelia stood still, the jacket resting across her shoulders like something more than fabric, like a boundary that had been drawn and would not be crossed again. She could feel the weight of it, not heavy, but present, a reminder that something had changed, something she had not asked for, but could not ignore. Kang Ji-hyun remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze steady, not lingering, not intrusive, but thoughtful, as if he were placing each detail of the evening into its proper place. Then, without raising his voice, he turned slightly toward the head housekeeper. "From now on, there will always be a night shift assigned," he said, his tone calm, but absolute, the kind of instruction that did not require repetition. "No exceptions." The woman nodded immediately, her posture straightening as if the clarity of the order had restored something in her as well. "Yes, sir." Jae-hyun's attention shifted again, this time to the staff gathered quietly along the edges of the room, those who had watched everything unfold without speaking. "And if there is ever a situation involving my son," he continued, "anyone who is present is expected to act. You do not wait for permission when it concerns his well-being." The words moved through the room with quiet force, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable in their intent. Amelia lowered her gaze slightly, not because she was being addressed directly, but because she understood that what had just been said reached her more than anyone else. It was not a correction. It was a recognition. Behind them, Soo-yeon remained still, her silence now different from before, no longer controlling, but reflective, as if she were replaying the evening in her mind and finding pieces that no longer aligned the way they once had. She stepped forward slowly, the sound of her heels softer now against the marble, less certain, less defined. "Jae-hyun," she said, her voice quieter, not fragile, but measured in a way it had not been earlier. "I did not know he was unwell." The statement hung in the air, incomplete, carrying with it something unspoken, something closer to acknowledgement than defense. Jae-hyun did not respond immediately. He allowed the silence to hold for a moment, long enough for the weight of the words to settle into something real. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a distance in it that had not been there before. "That is exactly the problem," he said. The simplicity of the response left no room for interpretation, no space for softening. And in that moment, Seo-yeon's composure shifted again, not collapsing, but adjusting, as if she were beginning to understand that this was not a moment that could be redirected or undone. Amelia remained still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged, but her presence now undeniable in a way it had never been before. She had not raised her voice. She had not defended herself beyond what was necessary. And yet, everything around her had changed. Jae-hyun glanced toward the staircase once more, his attention returning briefly to something beyond the room, something more important than the tension that still lingered behind him. "You should be checked again," he said quietly. Amelia nodded immediately. "I can go now," she replied. For a brief moment, their eyes met again, and this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only understanding. Jae-hyun stepped aside, creating space for her to pass, a small gesture, but one that carried a quiet respect that did not go unnoticed. Amelia moved past him, her steps steady, the jacket shifting slightly with her movement, the fabric catching the light as she headed toward the staircase. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. The path was clear in a way it had not been before. Behind her, the room remained still, Seo-yeon standing in place, watching as the figure she had dismissed only moments ago walked away with something that could not be taken back. And as Amelia reached the first step, the silence followed her. Not heavy, not oppressive, but deliberate, as if the house itself was acknowledging that the balance had shifted, not through force, not through noise, but through something far quieter, something that did not need to prove itself to be understood. The sound of Amelia's footsteps on the marble staircase was soft, steady, each step carrying her further away from the room, where everything had changed and closer to something quieter, something that did not need an audience to exist. The grand hall behind her remained still, but the stillness no longer followed her like pressure. It stayed behind, settling around those who had yet to move, those who were still processing what they had witnessed without fully understanding why it felt different from any other display of power they had seen before. The hallway above was dimmer, the lighting softer, the air cooler, and as Amelia reached the second floor, the noise of the evening faded completely, replaced by a silence that felt more honest, more grounded. She adjusted the jacket slightly around her shoulders, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness, the unfamiliar weight now something she carried with quiet intention. The door to the child's room stood slightly open, a thin line of warm light spilling into the hallway. She approached without hesitation and gently pushed it open, careful not to make a sound that might disturb what she hoped had already settled. Inside, The room was calm, untouched by the tension below, a small lamp casting a soft glow over neatly arranged furniture and a bed where Kang Ji-hyun's son lay sleeping, his breathing slow, uneven in the way of a child recovering from fever. Amelia stepped closer, her movements instinctive now, shaped not by the rules of the house, but by something deeper, something that did not need instruction. She placed the back of her hand lightly against his forehead, her touch gentle, practiced, and waited for the answer she already knew how to read. The warmth was still there, but lower now, manageable, no longer alarming. She exhaled softly, a breath she had been holding longer than she realized, and reached for the glass of water beside the bed, checking its level, adjusting the blanket slightly so it rested comfortably without trapping too much heat. Everything she did was quiet, precise, intentional, the kind of care that did not seek recognition because it existed whether anyone noticed or not. Downstairs, the silence remained, but it had shifted again, no longer centered around confrontation, but around what followed after it. Kang Ji-hyun stood near the base of the staircase. His gaze lifted slightly, not enough to intrude, but enough to acknowledge the direction Amelia had taken. He did not follow immediately. He did not call out. Instead, he remained where he was, as if giving the moment space to unfold without interference. Han Si-yeon stood several feet away, her posture no longer rigid, her expression no longer controlled in the way it had been earlier, but thoughtful, unsettled in a way that could not be easily hidden. "You trust her," she said quietly, the words not accusatory this time, but searching, as if she were trying to understand something that no longer fit within the expectation she had built. Jae-hyun did not look at her right away. His gaze remained fixed toward the staircase for a moment longer before he responded. "I trust what she did," he said. The distinction was subtle, but it carried weight because it was not about belief, it was about evidence, about action that spoke for itself without needing defense. Seo-yeon absorbed the response in silence, her eyes lowering briefly, the reflection of the empty hall catching faintly in the polished floor beneath her. Upstairs, Amelia stepped back from the bed, satisfied that the child was resting more comfortably, her movements slowing as the urgency faded, replaced by a quiet stillness that allowed her to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. She glanced once toward the doorway, as if aware of the distance between floors, between moments, between who she had been when the evening began and who she was now. Then she turned back, pulling a chair slightly closer to the bed, not to claim space, but to remain present, to ensure that if the child stirred again, he would not be alone. And in that quiet room, far from the eyes that had once judged her, Amelia sat, not as someone invisible, not as someone tolerated, but as someone whose presence had already proven its worth, in a way no words downstairs could undo. The room upstairs remained quiet, wrapped in a stillness that felt untouched by everything that had unfolded below, as if the world outside its walls had no authority here, no power to disturb what mattered most. Amelia sat beside the bed, her posture relaxed but attentive, her eyes occasionally drifting to the child's face, watching the slow rise and fall of his breathing, measuring it not with instruments, but with instinct, the kind that came from experience, from care given without expectation. The fever had eased, not completely gone, but no longer threatening, and that small change carried more weight than anything that had been said downstairs. She adjusted the blanket once more, her movements quiet, deliberate, ensuring comfort without disruption, then rested her hands lightly in her lap, allowing the moment to settle into something calm, something certain. Time passed without urgency, minutes stretching into something softer, less defined, until the faint sound of footsteps approached the doorway, measured, unhurried, familiar. Amelia did not turn immediately, but she felt the presence before she saw it, the same quiet authority that had shifted the entire house without raising its voice. Kang Ji-hyun stopped just outside the room, his silhouette framed by the softer hallway light, his gaze moving first to his son, then to Amelia, taking in the stillness, the care, the absence of chaos. He stepped inside without speaking, his movements careful, as if the silence itself deserved respect. For a moment, he simply stood there, observing, not as a man assessing a situation, but as a father seeing the result of someone else's attention. "Is he resting?" he asked quietly. Amelia nodded. "Yes, sir. His temperature is lower now. He should be fine if it continues to come down." Her voice was calm, steady, carrying no trace of the earlier tension, as if this room existed outside of it entirely. Ji-hyun moved closer to the bed, his gaze softening in a way that no one downstairs had seen, the distance in his expression replaced by something more personal, more grounded. He reached out briefly, placing his hand near his son's forehead, confirming what had already been done, then let his hand fall back to his side. "You stayed," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition. Amelia lowered her gaze slightly. "He needed someone," she replied. The simplicity of her answer lingered in the room, not demanding acknowledgement, but deserving it. Ji-hyun remained still for a moment longer, then turned slightly, his attention shifting back to her, his expression composed, but carrying a quiet clarity that had not been there before. "You will not be assigned to general duties tomorrow," he said. Amelia looked up, surprised, her posture straightening slightly. "Sir," she began, unsure of what that meant. "You will remain here," he continued, his tone calm, final, "until he is fully well." The words settled gently, but firmly, redefining her place in the house without spectacle, without announcement. Amelia hesitated, just briefly, as if adjusting to a reality she had not expected. "Yes, sir," she said softly. Jae-hyun nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any extended approval, then stepped back, allowing the room to return to its quiet rhythm. He paused at the doorway, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second longer, not on the situation, not on the tension that had once defined the evening, but on the presence that had changed it. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the hallway just as they had arrived, leaving behind a stillness that no longer felt heavy, but resolved. Amelia remained seated beside the bed, the jacket still resting across her shoulders, no longer unfamiliar, no longer borrowed in the way it had been before, but something that now carried meaning beyond its fabric. She looked once more at the child, then allowed her gaze to settle, her posture easing into quiet patience. Downstairs, the lights still glowed against empty marble, reflections lingering where voices once filled the space. But the house itself had changed, not in structure, not in design, but in something far less visible and far more lasting. And in that quiet, without announcement, without applause, something had been restored, something that had always been there, but had gone unseen until now. And that night, without a single raised voice, the house remembered what dignity looks like.